The neural interface burned like liquid fire behind James Calloway's eyes. Streams of incomprehensible data cascaded through his consciousness, a torrent of alien symbols, quantum-encrypted syntax, and nested linguistic algorithms that defied human comprehension. For the third time in as many hours, his neural implant overloaded, sending a cascade of error messages through his cerebral cortex. Blood trickled from his left nostril, a warm reminder of the physical toll of his impossible task. The Vox Imperium's diplomatic communication matrix was not a language. It was a weapon. Calloway's research station, a cramped, heavily shielded module orbiting a forgotten gas giant, looked more like a battlefield than a scientific workspace. Holographic displays flickered with impossible geometric patterns. Quantum processors hummed with barely contained energy, their cooling systems working overtime to prevent complete meltdown. He'd been recruited for this project because he was different. Where other linguists saw the Vox communication protocols as an immutable system of galactic interaction, Calloway saw a puzzle waiting to be shattered. His background was unconventional. A quantum linguist with a doctorate in synopsychological communication, Calloway had spent his entire career being told that certain things were impossible. The Vox Matrix was the ultimate challenge, a communication system so complex that it had broken every human and alien attempt to truly understand it. The Matrix wasn't just a language. It was a multi-dimensional computational construct that functioned simultaneously as communication, legal framework, mathematical proof, and cultural identifier. Each transmission was a labyrinth of meaning, with layers of context that would take traditional translators centuries to unpack. Most researchers would have submitted a failure report months ago. Most would have acknowledged the fundamental impossibility of the task. But James Calloway wasn't most researchers. As the neural interface sparked and crackled, he began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle, then erupted into a full-throated roar of defiance. Blood continued to drip, mixing with the complex holographic projections that surrounded him. The latest crash had occurred during a standard translation protocol test. The Vox Matrix had presented what it considered a simple communication scenario, a diplomatic exchange about mineral rights on a contested asteroid belt. To any other species, it would have been an incomprehensible series of nested logical statements, probability calculations, and contextual references that spanned multiple cultural and temporal dimensions. Calloway's team had been working for months. Brilliant linguists, quantum programmers, and xenocommunication specialists from a dozen different species had all tried and failed. The Vox Matrix seemed designed to be unbreakable, a system so complex that it functioned as a form of intellectual control. But where others saw an impenetrable fortress, Calloway saw opportunity. On the wall of his research station, a massive holographic board began to fill with diagrams. They looked like nothing so much as abstract art, neural network sketches that defied traditional computational logic. Fractals of potential communication pathways twisted and merged, creating something entirely new. His assistant, Dr. Aria Lynn, watched from the doorway. A brilliant xenolinguist in her own right, she had long since learned that trying to interrupt Calloway during these moments was futile. "You're going to kill yourself," she said matter-of-factly, her cybernetic eye tracking the rapid movements of his hands through the holographic interface. Calloway didn't even look up. "No," he responded, his voice a mixture of determination and something else, something that bordered on maniacal inspiration. "I'm going to break their entire system." The first seeds of a communication revolution were taking root, and the Vox Imperium had no idea what was coming. The grand diplomatic nexus of the Vox Imperium was a monument to architectural impossibility. Crystalline structures that defied Euclidean geometry twisted through 17-dimensional space, each surface a living tapestry of communication protocols and bureaucratic complexity. Ambassador Xelnaga descended from the upper chambers, 6 sets of mandibles clicking with contemptuous rhythm. The massive alien towered 3 meters tall, its exoskeleton a prismatic shell of iridescent scales that shifted color with each diplomatic emotion, a biological communication system far more complex than most species' entire linguistic frameworks. Dr. James Calloway. The ambassador's translation matrix produced a sound like grinding glass and liquid nitrogen. Your species lacks the cognitive complexity to comprehend our communication matrix. The diplomatic chamber fell silent. Hundreds of alien observers from dozens of species watched the confrontation. This was more than a meeting. It was a ritual, a blood sport of intellectual combat where reputations were destroyed and galactic hierarchies were defined. Calloway stood perfectly still. Where most humans would have shown fear or deference, he radiated a dangerous kind of calm. His neural interface hummed almost imperceptibly, a testament to the weeks of preparation that had led to this moment. The Vox had invited him here as a formality, a public demonstration of human intellectual limitations. They expected him to fail, to break down, to provide a spectacular example of why humanity would never be more than a footnote in galactic diplomacy. They had no idea what was coming. Area Lynn sat in the observation chamber, her cybernetic eye recording every microscopic detail. She knew Calloway had prepared something extraordinary. The data packets he'd been developing were unlike anything in known xenolinguistic history. Selnaga continued, each word a weapon designed to humiliate. Your attempts to deconstruct our communication matrix are equivalent to a child trying to understand quantum mechanics by chewing on mathematical textbooks. Most species would have wilted under such a verbal assault. The Vox communication style was designed to be psychological warfare. Each statement a multi-layered attack that simultaneously conveyed information, emotional dominance, and cultural superiority. Calloway's response came not as words, but as a data packet. It hit the diplomatic chamber like a quantum thunderbolt. The Vox translator systems began to fracture. Holographic displays flickered and warped. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the perfect Vox communication matrix showed signs of complete, catastrophic breakdown. What Calloway had created wasn't just a translation algorithm. It was an intellectual virus that attacked the very fundamental assumptions of the Vox communication system. Selnaga's mandibles froze mid-click. The ambassador's exoskeleton began to shift colors in patterns never before seen. Pure, unfiltered confusion. What have you done? The translation matrix produced a sound between a scream and a mathematical equation. Calloway smiled, a simple, dangerous human smile that contained more meaning than entire libraries of Vox diplomatic archives. I'm rewriting the rules, he said simply. The diplomatic community watched in shocked silence. Some species leaned forward in fascination. Others began to retreat, sensing something fundamental was changing. This was more than a diplomatic meeting. This was the first salvo in a war of communication, of understanding, of fundamental galactic paradigms. And humanity had just fired the opening shot. The data spread like a quantum contagion. Within 72 hours of the diplomatic confrontation, Calloway's communication matrix had infiltrated networks across 3 galactic sectors. What had begun as a theoretical challenge was now a full-scale intellectual insurgency. Research stations that had spent decades struggling with the Vox communication protocols suddenly found themselves breathing free. The complex, suffocating layers of alien bureaucratic language began to dissolve, replaced by something remarkably simple yet devastatingly effective. Dr. Area Lynn tracked the spread from their orbital research hub. Each data transmission was a work of art, an algorithmic symphony that rewrote the very fundamentals of interspecies communication. The quantum processors around her hummed with an almost musical intensity, mapping the exponential growth of Calloway's breakthrough. It's not just a translation matrix, she muttered to herself, watching holographic displays explode with cascading information patterns. It's a complete communication revolution. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Meridian colonies, a collection of mining settlements perpetually caught in bureaucratic limbo, were the first to fully implement Calloway's system. Diplomatic requests that had been stalled for generations were suddenly resolved in hours. A mining administrator named Elena Rodriguez sent the first comprehensive report. Her message was brutally simple. We can finally understand each other. The Vox Imperium's response was immediate and predictable. Communication blockades went up. Entire data networks were isolated. They attempted to contain the spread of what they saw as an intellectual virus. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human innovation. Each attempt to block the communication matrix only helped it spread further. Like an adaptive organism, Calloway's system learned, evolved, found new pathways. It wasn't just a translation tool. It was a living, breathing network of understanding. Scientific outposts began to adopt the method. Small colonies that had been marginalized by the Vox's Byzantine communication systems suddenly found themselves able to negotiate, to be heard, to exist on their own terms. Dr. Marcus Chen, a quantum programmer who had been part of Calloway's original team, began documenting the spread. His analysis revealed something extraordinary. The communication matrix was developing its own form of collective intelligence. It wasn't just translating. It was understanding. The first hint of panic began to ripple through the Vox Imperium's central communications hub. This was more than a technological breakthrough. This was a fundamental challenge to their entire system of galactic control. Calloway watched the development from his research station, a slight smile playing across his lips. His neural interface continued to process impossible amounts of data, tracking the spread of something that was no longer just his invention. It had become a living movement. We're not just changing how we communicate, he told Arya during a late-night strategy session. We're changing how intelligent species understand each other. The algorithmic wildfire continued to spread, and nothing could stop it now. The research facility looked like a battlefield of intelligence. Quantum processors smoldered. Neural interfaces lay in carefully dissected pieces across workstations. Holographic displays flickered with impossible geometric patterns that seemed to breathe with their own form of alien life. Dr. Elena Rodriguez clamped her hand against a malfunctioning data core, her cybernetic augmentation sparking with frustration. We're not just developing a communication system, she shouted to no one in particular. We're staging an intellectual insurgency. Calloway's team was unlike any research group in galactic history. They weren't just linguists or programmers. They were rebels, visionaries, outcasts from a dozen different species who had been told their entire lives that certain things were impossible. There was Dr. Kravix, a silicon-based life form from the Andromeda Reach, whose crystalline neural structure allowed him to perceive communication patterns humans couldn't even imagine. Next to him worked Dr. Arya Lynn, her cybernetic eye constantly recalibrating, tracking data streams that would have driven a normal human mind to complete breakdown. The latest iteration of the communication matrix had just failed spectacularly. But failure, to this team, was just another form of data. The Vox communication system isn't a language, Calloway explained during a late-night strategy session. It's a method of control. Every nested layer, every complex probability calculation, every contextual reference, it's designed to prevent true understanding. A holographic representation of the Vox matrix materialized, a three-dimensional nightmare of interconnected nodes that twisted through impossible geometric shapes. Where most saw complexity, Calloway saw a puzzle waiting to be dismantled. Their approach was revolutionary. Instead of trying to understand the Vox system, they were learning to unlearn everything they knew about communication. Dr. Rodriguez had brought breakthrough research from the Meridian mining colonies. Decades of bureaucratic deadlock had been resolved in weeks using early versions of the Matrix. It wasn't just about translation. It was about fundamental connection. Communication isn't about perfectly reproducing words, Kravix noted, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that suggested deep contemplation. It's about understanding the fundamental intent behind those words. Another processor exploded. Nobody flinched. The team was pushing beyond the boundaries of known linguistic science. They were developing a communication system that was part language, part adaptive intelligence, part pure human creativity. Calloway's neural interface began to compile their latest dataset. Each failure was a step closer to success. Each breakdown revealed another layer of possibility. "We're not just creating a new way of talking," he muttered, blood trickling from his nose as the interface pushed beyond its designed limits. "We're creating a new way of understanding." The Vox Imperium was watching, monitoring, preparing their response. But they had no idea what was coming. Outside the research station, the forgotten gas giant continued its eternal rotation, indifferent to the intellectual revolution being born within its gravitational embrace. This was more than a research project. This was a revolution of understanding. The galactic diplomatic convergence was never meant to be a battlefield. Delegates from 317 different species filled the massive spherical chamber, its walls a living membrane of quantum reactive surfaces that could simultaneously translate, analyze, and contextualize every spoken word. Normally, such a gathering would be an exercise in carefully managed diplomatic theater, each species performing an intricate dance of protocol and indirect communication. Today would be different. Dr. James Calloway walked into the chamber wearing nothing special, standard research blacks, a neural interface barely visible against his temple. To the assembled delegates, he looked like nothing more than another human researcher. They had no idea they were watching the moment everything would change. A territorial dispute between the Krull Combine and the Synaptic Concordance had remained unresolved for 7 generations. 3 previous mediation attempts had ended in complete failure. Centuries of miscommunication, cultural misunderstandings, and bureaucratic complexity had created an impenetrable wall of diplomatic gridlock. Calloway's communication matrix was about to demolish that wall. The initial presentation was deceptively simple. No grand speeches, no complex presentations, just a series of data transmissions that began to unravel the centuries of misunderstanding with surgical precision. Dr. Aria Lynn watched from the observation deck, her cybernetic eye tracking every microscopic reaction. The Krull representatives, silicon-based beings whose communication traditionally involved complex quantum entanglement signals, began to shift in their seats. The Synaptic Concordance delegates, typically motionless energy constructs, showed the first signs of genuine emotional response anyone had ever witnessed. 63 minutes later, the impossible happened. A resolution was reached. Not a temporary compromise, not a bureaucratic patch. A genuine, fundamental understanding that addressed the core issues that had divided these species for generations. The chamber went silent. Then the ripples began. Smaller species that had long been marginalized by the Vox Imperium's complex communication systems suddenly found themselves able to articulate generations of suppressed grievances. Communication channels that had been blocked for centuries began to open. What the Vox Imperium had created as a system of control was now being used as a tool of liberation. Ambassador Excel Naga watched from the upper diplomatic tier, mandibles clicking in a pattern of pure, unfiltered panic. This was more than a technological breakthrough. This was a complete dismantling of the existing galactic communication hierarchy. "This changes everything," Aria whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Calloway stood at the center of the chamber, seemingly calm. But those who knew him, those who understood the depth of his vision, could see the subtle triumph in his eyes. The first cracks in the galactic communication system had just become a full-scale earthquake, and humanity had just rewritten the rules of diplomatic engagement. The Vox Imperium's response was predictably brutal. Entire communication networks went dark. Quantum encryption fields blanketed critical sectors. Diplomatic channels that had been open for millennia suddenly collapsed like dying stars. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were fighting. Calloway's communication matrix wasn't just a technology. It was a living, adaptive intelligence that learned faster than any system in galactic history. Each attempt to block, to contain, to destroy only made it stronger. Dr. Elena Rodriguez coordinated the counter-strategy from a mobile research station hidden within the magnetic interference of a dying neutron star. The location was deliberate, a middle finger to traditional communication protocols that relied on clear, predictable transmission channels. They're treating this like a traditional conflict, She told Arielin, holographic displays dancing around her with impossible complexity. But we're fighting a war of understanding, not of technology. The first wave of Vox counterattacks came through traditional channels. Economic sanctions, communication blockades, diplomatic isolations that would have destroyed any other species' ability to operate. But the network Calloway had created was decentralized, adaptive, impossible to cut off completely. Small colonies that had been silent for generations suddenly found voices. Mining outposts, research stations, planetary settlements that had existed in bureaucratic shadows for centuries began to communicate in ways never before possible. Each attempted suppression became a new avenue of transmission. Ambassador Naga discovered something terrifying. The communication matrix was learning, not just translating or transmitting, but understanding. It was developing a form of collective intelligence that transcended individual species limitations. Calloway's original design had been brilliant, but what was emerging was something far more profound. The neural interfaces began to show something unprecedented. The communication matrix was creating connections between species that had never even considered communication possible. Silicon-based life forms, energy constructs, biological entities from environments so different they defied traditional understanding. We're not just breaking rules, Calloway muttered during a late-night strategy session. We're revealing the fundamental connections that have always existed. The Vox had designed their communication system as a weapon of control, a way to manage, to limit, to contain the vast diversity of galactic intelligence. Humanity had turned that weapon into a tool of liberation. Quantum transmission nodes that had been silent for generations began to pulse with new life. Diplomatic channels that had been bureaucratic dead zones suddenly sparked with genuine understanding. This was more than a technological breakthrough. This was a revolution of connection. And the Vox Imperium was about to discover that the more they tried to fight it, the faster it would spread. The asymmetric tsunami of understanding was unstoppable. The galactic scientific convergence had never seen anything like it. Centuries of established xenolinguistic theory were being dismantled in real time, piece by excruciating piece. Traditional researchers watched in horror and fascination as Calloway's team systematically exposed the fundamental flaws in every existing communication model. Dr. Marcus Chen stood at the primary podium, his presentation less a scientific talk and more an intellectual demolition. Holographic displays erupted with data that challenged everything known about interspecies communication. Each slide was a quantum bomb, obliterating years of carefully constructed academic hierarchies. Communication is not about translation, Chen declared, his voice cutting through the chamber like a laser. It's about connection, understanding, the fundamental recognition of sentience across seemingly insurmountable barriers. The assembled xenolinguists represented the most brilliant minds from 300 different species, crystalline intelligences, energy-based consciousness, biological entities from environments so diverse they defied traditional classification. They had spent careers building complex models of communication, and now those models were crumbling before their eyes. Dr. Arielin tracked the reactions through her advanced neural interface. Panic, excitement, terror, breakthrough. The emotional spectrum rippled through the assembled researchers like a quantum wave. Ambassador Naga watched from the diplomatic observation deck, mandibles clicking in a rhythm of pure, unfiltered anxiety. The Vox Imperium's entire system of galactic control was being dismantled not through military might, but through pure, unfiltered understanding. Calloway's communication matrix had become something more than a technology. It was a living proof of a fundamental truth, that intelligence, at its core, seeks connection. The most radical revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kravix, the silicon-based researcher, demonstrated how the matrix could bridge communication between species that had previously been considered completely incompatible. Energy constructs communicating with liquid-based life forms. Quantum intelligence is finding common ground with biological neural networks. We've been looking at communication backwards, Kravitz explained. its crystalline form refracting light in complex patterns of meaning. We thought it was about translating words. It's about translating consciousness. Each scientific presentation was a nail in the coffin of old communication theories. Traditional xenolinguists found themselves defending decades of research against an approach that was simultaneously more simple and more complex than anything they had ever conceived. The communication matrix was evolving, learning, growing beyond its original design. What had started as Calloway's personal challenge had become a galactic revolution of understanding. Species that had been silent for generations were finding voices. Diplomatic deadlocks that had persisted for centuries were dissolving. The very concept of alien was being redefined in real time. This is more than a breakthrough, Calloway said quietly to Arya during a moment of reflection. This is the moment we stop being separate species and start being a collective intelligence. The Vox Imperium's carefully constructed system of control was crumbling. And in its place, something remarkable was emerging. A true understanding that transcended language, technology, and the very concept of communication itself. The final diplomatic session would be remembered as the moment everything changed. The Galactic Central Chamber, a structure so massive it could house entire planetary ecosystems, fell absolutely silent. Delegates from 317 different species sat motionless, their collective consciousness held by a single moment of pure, unfiltered possibility. James Calloway stood at the center, no longer just a researcher, but something more. A catalyst, a bridge between what was and what could be. Ambassador Xelnaga, once the most powerful diplomatic entity in the known galaxy, now looked diminished. The Vox Imperium's intricate communication system, once an unbreakable fortress of control, lay exposed, its fundamental flaws laid bare for everyone to see. Dr. Arya Lynn watched from the observation deck, her cybernetic eye tracking every microscopic detail. This was more than a diplomatic resolution. This was the moment humanity rewrote the rules of galactic interaction. Calloway's communication matrix had done something unprecedented. It had not just translated between species. It had created a form of understanding that transcended language, biology, and technological barriers. For millennia, Calloway began, his voice carrying through the chamber without amplification. We've treated communication as a problem to be solved, a barrier to be overcome. But communication is a living thing. It's connection. It's understanding. The demonstration was simple yet profound. Using the matrix, he began to show how species that had been locked in conflict for generations could truly understand each other. Not just the words, but the fundamental intentions, the hopes, the fears, the dreams. A territorial dispute that had lasted 7 centuries was resolved in minutes. Cultural misunderstandings that had seemed impossible to bridge suddenly became transparent. The matrix wasn't just translating. It was revealing the fundamental commonalities of sentient experience. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been crucial in developing the early iterations of the system, leaned forward. This was the moment they had dreamed of. A true universal translator that went beyond words. The Vox Imperium's entire system of galactic control was crumbling. Their communication matrix, once a tool of suppression, was being transformed into a tool of genuine connection. "We're not destroying your system," Calloway explained to the stunned delegates. "We're evolving it, showing what's possible when we stop seeing each other as alien and start seeing each other as intelligent beings." Species that had been marginalized for generations found voices. Diplomatic channels that had been bureaucratic dead zones suddenly sparked with genuine understanding. The very concept of alien was being redefined in real time. Ambassador Xelnaga, in a moment that would be recorded in galactic history, did something unprecedented. The alien stood, mandibles opening in a gesture of complete surrender and understanding. "We were wrong," the ambassador said, the translation matrix carrying not just words, but the full depth of emotion behind them. Calloway smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of understanding. This was more than a technological breakthrough. This was the moment humanity proved that true intelligence is about connection, about finding common ground, about understanding. The new horizon of galactic communication had begun.